American democracy had a near-death experience a year ago. This year will test its vital signs. So as we all know, this past January 6th was the anniversary of the Jan 6 insurrection at the Capitol buildings. And of course, the mainstream left-leaning narrative around this event is that Trump and his anti-globalist and nationalist policies, and along with his 74 million supporters who are actually stout defenders of the American Constitution, which, as far as I remember, is the founding document of American democracy. Somehow they are a threat to democracy, whereas the Marxist, socialist progressives on the left, who are actively working to dismantle the Constitution, specifically the First and Second Amendments, somehow they are the protectors of American democracy. As I record this video, a massive convoy of tens of thousands of truckers and regular Canadians from all corners of this enormous country, cheered on by thousands in every city and town that they pass through, are making their way to the capital of Canada, Ottawa, and our Parliament buildings. Now, of course, our Prime Minister doesn't approve of this fringe minority.
The small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa or who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing do not represent the views of Canadians who have been there for each other, who know that following the science and stepping up to protect each other is the best way to continue to ensure our freedoms, our rights, our values as a country.
So as this battle of the narrative wages on from the left and the right of the political spectrum, we need to ask this simple question. What is the real threat to democracy? Is it Trump, the truckers, or is it Justin Trudeau? Let's discuss. So I was inspired to create this video when I came across a specific article here on the CBC on January 4th, published by their Washington correspondent, Alexander Panetta, with that excellent headline, "American Democracy Had a Near-Death Experience a Year Ago." I literally laughed out loud when I read it, and not to, downplay the severity of, some of the violence that did take place on January 6th. However, it is fascinating to watch the mainstream media and how they are painting this narrative, and this article is just a perfect example of that. Now, of course, Alex Panetta would never dare mention any questions or criticism of this narrative if he wants to keep his job, because this would cancel his journalistic career immediately at the CBC. And we already know this, especially because producer Tara Henley recently quit the CBC and published an excellent article. If you haven't read it, I'll post a link here before, basically stating what a propaganda arm CBC has become over the last 18 months. She states that by the time she resigned last month, the CBC embodied some of the worst trends in mainstream media, and she goes on to speak specifically about these. I love this sentence here because this is exactly how I feel about the CBC and most mainstream news here in Canada, all of it. In a short period of time, the CBC went from being a trusted source of news to churning out clickbait that reads like a parody of the student press. She is not wrong. Now, if you don't know, the CBC is actually state funded. It is funded by our government, and it literally has become the propaganda arm for our Liberal government and Justin Trudeau. We'll speak more about that. She goes on to say, it has become less adversarial to government and corporations and more hostile to ordinary people with ideas that Twitter doesn't like. It is to allow sweeping societal changes like lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and school closures to roll out with little no debate. To see billionaires amass extraordinary wealth and bureaucrats amass enormous power with little scrutiny. Okay, I won't spend any more time on this excellent article that she wrote. You have to read it. I will link to it in the description. But the point being is that it is now clear and evident of this narrative, this globalist, corporate government-sponsored narrative. And so Alex Panetta is simply a propagandist propagating this narrative. So let's get to the crux of this video. Let's talk about the real threat to democracy. Is it the right? Is it Trump? Is it his populist nationalist ideas and the millions of supporters who embody those ideas? Is it these defenders of the American Constitution, these defenders of the First and Second Amendment? Are they a real threat to democracy? Or could it possibly be the mainstream, the popular, socialist, progressive, left-leaning, here in Canada, liberal agenda that has dominated politics here in Canada for over the last decade? Now, before we can truly examine this question, we've got to understand what we're talking about. So let's first of all outline, what is democracy? What is it that we're defending here? And the easiest way to do that is to talk about the pillars of democracy. Now, of course, we can debate the details of democracy because there's so many different kinds of democracies all across the world, but I wanted to keep it simple. So for the purposes of this video, in the preparation of it, I've pulled out 6 specific pillars of democracy. I hope that you agree with most of those. So we'll start out with the first pillar, political power through fair and open elections. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the theories and investigations here on the legitimacy of the US or the Canadian elections, although there are some questions. You know, you've got your electronic voting technology, you've got the whole Dominion machines and all of that, and that's a whole other episode, so I'm just going to leave this here. However, what I'm going to mention on this pillar, as far as the Canadian elections which are concerned, which we just had just recently in the fall, is how absolutely biased, and this ties in with one of the other pillars, how absolutely biased the Canadian mainstream media was with their coverage of our most recent election. Now, although the People's Party of Canada, which is a relatively new party, and really our only conservative party at this point, was polling higher than the completely irrelevant Green Party, which is an absolute joke. I mean, let's just be honest about it. The leader of the People's Party, Maxime Bernier, was not invited to the national televised debates. The leader of the Green Party was, okay? He wasn't allowed to be at the debates, he wasn't invited, and he was barely mentioned in the mainstream press until the popularity of the People's Party in the alternative media could no longer be ignored by the mainstream media. It's as if they didn't even want Canadians to know that the People's Party existed. The mainstream media has done an excellent job, especially the CBC, in, of course, painting PPC and Maxime Bernier as a racist, a bigot, a homophobe, an anti-Semite, and all those other words that they like to throw around to discredit people. So just on that basis alone, the horrible coverage by the mainstream media, not allowing him to be at the national debate, just shows you that our election was absolutely not fair. It wasn't fair that the Canadian people didn't get a chance to hear from a political party that was polling higher than the Green Party, and yet they did get to hear from the Green Party. So obviously, this wasn't a fair election just from that standpoint alone. All right, so now let's address the next 2 pillars. I'm going to talk about the next 2 pillars together. I've got several points here that I want to make, and they kind of overlap with each other. The rule of law and a constitution, that's pillar number 2, and the decentralization of power, having those 3 separate branches so that not all of the power of government is centralized, you know, in the Prime Minister's hands, which unfortunately is the trend that's been happening here in Canada for the last few years. Now, when we look at the rule of law, we can see how the rule of law has been completely suspended over the last couple of years and has not gone through the proper processes. There have been emergency mandates that have been instituted across this country, many of which are breaching the Constitution. And yet they haven't gone through the proper legislative processes to actually legislate these laws. Instead, they have all come under emergency orders. So without due process, without the rule of law, and without the proper legislative process that we have in place to protect our democracy. Now, recently, a group of lawyers have come together and created the Free North Declaration. And I'm going to play just the opening clip here from this video so that you can hear from what these lawyers have to say.
This is not healthy. This is not how you build a civil society. This is not how you sustain one. The fabric of society is a thin veneer, and it doesn't take much to destroy it. And that was obvious to some of us in March of 2020. You cannot simply flick a switch and turn off a complex society and not expect there to be severe consequences that we will be living with for generations.
We are Canadian lawyers.
In our country, civil liberties are under unprecedented attack.
Governments, public health authorities, universities, public and private employers, municipalities, and businesses
are trampling Canadians' rights and freedoms.
Our free society is at risk. Legislatures have passed statutes that delegate broad discretionary powers to unelected public health officials, who then create draconian legal restrictions by fiat without public scrutiny or open debate. These directives give cover to private and public employers to suspend and dismiss workers who insist upon their right to decide their own medical treatments. In our system of law, no principle is more important than the right to control your own body and to make your own medical and health decisions. An anxious populace, swept up in a deliberate campaign of fear, now believes that individual liberties upon which our liberal democracy is founded are dangerous and selfish. A growing collectivism that demands safety at the expense of autonomy shapes public policy.
Now that is frightening. From the lawyer's mouth, that is a threat to democracy. Now, what was interesting in our interview with Brian Peckford, who's the last surviving architect of Canada's Constitution, was that he mentioned to us that what we're seeing in Canada right now is actually nothing new, that this deterioration of democracy has actually been happening for many, many years. And in my preparation for this video, I came across another interesting book. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I will link to an article about this book because it speaks to the same issues. This book was written in 2019 by Donald Savoy, Democracy in Canada, the Disintegration of Our Institutions. And if you read the headline of this article here by John Ivison, it states, timely book warns that Canada's democracy is threatened by political abuse. Political power is no longer located in Parliament, political parties, cabinet, or the bureaucracy, which is supposed to be that separation of power in the three branches. He argues in this book that it is now held by the Prime Minister, his advisors, the lobbyists, corporations, and the rich. Now, this is absolutely frightening because we're seeing the results of that now in the past 2 years during this pandemic, what they've been able to accomplish as far as stripping away at the Constitution and stripping away at human rights. This right here is the real threat to democracy. And I'm going to let Brian Peckford explain what this means.
But I want to say to you, as a Canadian who was born in Canada, well, I wasn't really born in Canada. I was born in Newfoundland before Confederation. I was 7 years old when we joined Canada, but for all intents and purposes, I was born a Canadian. This is not something that happened just since the pandemic came. The deterioration of our democracy started a number of decades ago. When they began taking when we started changing the curriculum in the schools and the civics was no longer a subject even, the same way with history, the history of Canada, we were beginning then to go down a very slippery slope where we were going to have people who came out of high school who did not know very much about the history or geography of their own country and the politics and the history and on that side of it. And then the erosion of the Parliament of Canada was happening simultaneously with this, when more and more power left the Parliament and went to the Prime Minister's office, and more particularly to the Privy Council office, which is attached to the Prime Minister. And when it becomes powerful, like it did during Mr. Trudeau's time, when we had the SNC-Lavalin affair, he closed it down with his majority. So we've had really the tyranny of the majority with no checks and balances on it. In the United States, they have an elected Senate and 2 senators from every state, regardless of how big it is. They have some checks and balances and open congressional hearings that we don't have in Canada. So they do have some checks and balances that we don't have, as much as a lot of Canadians love to attack the elephant from our mouse position. So we have to understand that this has been a gradual deterioration of democratic principles. Democratic governance has happened over a number of decades, and now has reached this point where the Prime Minister of Canada can break the law 5 times and get re-elected. Break the law 5 times and get re-elected. So when that's happening, then the next stage is when something of a crisis occurs. You know, it's almost like, in its own way, the War Measures Act reenacted for a different kind of circumstance. What the governments and the federal government are doing now. We have to understand, because we became comfortable as a society and we advanced materially quite well and became one of the wealthier nations of the world, unfortunately, concomitant with that is a deterioration of the civic duty as people perceive it to be by the individual. And therefore, we all get lazy and complacent and apathetic and don't participate in the democracy of our country like we should do in order to keep that democracy. Democracy only lasts when there is a high participation of the individuals in that democracy. As the participation declines, so does democracy. And so it's an extremely fragile operation. It's an extremely fragile thing to put into play and make it work long term. It has to be renewed and the individuals have to be involved. So that's where we find ourselves today now, is that it now has manifested itself not only in the Prime Minister breaking the law, not only in the Prime Minister's office having more power than Parliament, shutting down parliamentary committees and stopping information flow. It has now manifested itself in actions by all the governments of Canada in creating fear and panic in the people, not based upon good science, as any independent scientific study has now shown.
Now, as if that wasn't bad enough, let's talk about pillar number 4, a free and independent press. Now, just to give you an idea of the Canadian media landscape, all of Canada's primary national news sources for the majority of Canadians, all of them are left-leaning, progressive, socialist, left-leaning. There is zero conservative representation in Canada nationally, zero, and very few locally. Almost all conservative-leaning media is now independent and primarily online. Globe and Mail, National Post, Global News, CTV, and CBC, which is sponsored government propaganda arm of the Liberal government. Those are all of the national news sources, all of them left-leaning. Now, the idea that our mainstream media is funded by the government and is essentially a propaganda arm for the government isn't just opinion, it is fact, because they are literally being given money. Now, this article here is from 2018. It was all about the Liberals' $600 million aid package, which will politicize the press. Now, on top of that, this was in 2018. We don't know how much other future money has been given. This is a recent article here from 2021, from the summer of 2021, just this past summer. And the headline is brilliant. How can a country still be considered a democracy when our tax dollars are given without our knowledge or consent to media organizations that will then report on the election campaign and shape public perception? And this fear of Canada losing democracy, which I think we've already lost, is evident in this article as well. It's been clear for some time that Canada is not really a fully democratic country, particularly inside of those political parties. You can't speak up inside of a political party or they just kick you out. But he goes on to say, if the government was secretly giving away our taxpayer dollars to media organizations, specifically ahead of an election, that would constitute a much larger assault on democracy in Canada. And as you've probably guessed, that's exactly what the Liberals have just done. So the Trudeau government has given $61 million of taxpayer dollars to media publishers just ahead of the election, simply calling it emergency relief, literally paying off the media. Now, on top of the money that the government is funding to mainstream media, they also want to censor independent media. Trudeau Liberals to push ahead with internet regulations, Bill C-10 in new Parliament. Now, what this bill would do would essentially mean that independent producers like myself, recording a video from my home, may have to abide by CRTC standards. There would be incredible regulations and restrictions on independent voices on social media. This is an actual bill that the Trudeau government, the Trudeau Liberals, are trying to pass under the guise of protection and elimination of hate speech. And just to give you an idea of Trudeau's absolute contempt for dissenting voices, I'll just play you this clip. This was during the election. Rebel News Media is one of the few conservative, independent news organizations. Again, they are completely online based. And of course, they're going to be smeared with all this left-wing propaganda about who they are. But they were actually able to get themselves, they are accredited journalists, they were finally able to get themselves into the debates and were able to pose a question to Justin Trudeau himself. But look at the absolute hatred that Justin Trudeau has towards independent voices here in Canada.
Ma question est la suivante. L'Israël est l'un des pays les plus vaccinés au monde. Ils sont rendus maintenant à leur 4e rappel de vaccin. Ils ne considèrent plus que ceux qui ont reçu 2 doses de vaccin sont pleinement vaccinés. Ma question est, plusieurs Canadiens ne désirent pas avoir un rappel de vaccin. Allez-vous leur enlever leurs privilèges reliés au vaccinal? Et aurez-vous l'obligeance de répondre à ma question en tant que Premier ministre ou allez-vous encore diaboliser mon média?
J'ai partagé ma perspective sur ton organisation hier soir. J'ai plus rien à dire.
Ça demande bien qui vous êtes. Merci.
Amazing, right? Absolute smug indifference to an actual legitimate question that many Canadians, a concern that many Canadians had. And she literally said, would you give us the respect of answering the question? And he absolutely would not. This is what he thinks of independent dissenting voices that don't agree with his viewpoint. Now this, if anything, is an absolute danger to our freedom and our democracy. This is Justin Trudeau. Now I could go on and I could, show you countless clips of the treatment of journalists, how his bodyguards treat independent media and independent journalists, throwing aside a good friend of ours when she dared to ask him a question, physically assaulting another journalist who was simply literally standing on the sidewalk trying to report during one of Trudeau's campaign stops. This is absolutely frightening to see not only the manipulation of mainstream media by our Liberal Trudeau government, but the absolute hatred that he has to dissenting independent voices. All right, so moving on to pillars number 5 and 6. Pillar number 5 is active participation and consent of its citizens. And yes, we've been lazy. The Honourable Brian Peckford mentioned in his interview how important participation of the citizenry is to uphold a democracy. And I'll be one of the first to admit that I'll take responsibility for that. I've been lazy. I haven't been involved in politics. I could care less about the Canadian government and what they've been doing for the last couple of decades. And I guess it's our complacency that's at fault here. But it's time for us to now stand up and to say enough is enough. It's better late than never, I guess. Okay, so let's move on to the sixth and final pillar. Talk about and look at fundamental human rights. Now, there's several different human rights that we can look at. We start with something as basic as freedom of speech, and we were just talking about the hate that the Liberal government has for independent dissenting voices. They've got the internet censorship bill, which has the threat of potentially censoring us online, so that we cannot even have these type of communications. I don't know if I would be even allowed to create videos like this. Would I need a license? If I say something wrong, would I be thrown in jail? Like, where is this going to go, right? What is the definition of hate speech? Is this video hate speech against our Prime Minister because I disagree with his viewpoints and I think he's a threat to democracy? How far could this potentially go? Next, you have freedom of association. Well, just this past Christmas, just a month ago, limiting who I can gather for. For Christmas and New Year's Eve, we were told by the government specifically that we who were unjabbed, we shall not gather. We could not gather with anybody for Christmas or for New Year's celebrations. Of course, we did, but our families, they were told that our families, who may actually still watch the propaganda mainstream news, they were explicitly told not to invite us, not to allow us to gather with them. Now, freedom of religion is another fundamental human right. And of course, here in Canada, we've had the closing of churches, which interestingly enough, they were closing churches when casinos and strip clubs and liquor stores were still open. So it's really interesting how that was going on. We have had numerous arrests of pastors and literal barricading of churches when certain pastors decided to stand up against these unconstitutional mandates. Of course, you've got famous fellow Polish freedom fighter, a man who, like my family, came from a communist country. So he understands communism and tyranny and the rise of these socialist-marxist ideologies. In communist Poland, we were forced to practice religion in underground basement churches, and that's exactly what was happening in Canada here in 2020 and 2021. These were all unprecedented moves by our governments, extreme overreach of their power to limit who you could gather, who you could associate with, how you could worship your beliefs, your spiritual beliefs. To arrest pastors in the way that they did, to target them in the way that they have. One of the pastors sat in solitary confinement for over a month because he refused to close his doors to his church. I mean, this is absolute insanity and an absolute threat to our freedom and democracy. And now here we are in 2022, and our government is actually discussing the possibilities of mandatory inoculations. In Quebec, in one of our provinces, they've actually just instituted a tax for those that decide to remain unjabbed. Now, this goes against all fundamental human rights. Our fundamental autonomy over our own bodies to decide what we do with our bodies and what goes inside of our own bodies. To now give up this autonomy and give over that to the state, to our government, is absolutely unprecedented. I mean, to me, this is blatant slavery. Just look at the definition of the word slave. One who is owned as the property of someone else. One who is subservient to or controlled by another. If I don't get to control what goes inside of my body, what medications, what medical treatments are done on my body, I am no longer an independent and free citizen. I am no longer a free human being. I am now owned. I am the property of somebody else. I am literally a slave. How anybody in Canada or around the world can stand by and think that this is okay is absolutely frightening. That's probably the biggest threat to our democracy, actually, is the people that are standing by and thinking that these freedom passports and that mandatory forced inoculation is somehow good for our safety. This is what's frightening. So as you can see, if we actually look at the pillars of what makes a free democracy, we can see very clearly that it's not Trump and the right-wing nationalists who are a threat to democracy, as the left-wing mainstream media would like you to believe. The real threat to democracy is the left-wing Marxist ideologies, the progressive socialists, the liberal agenda, and Justin Trudeau himself. All right, I want to hear your comments, thoughts, and feedback and responses in the comments below. Please share with us. Let's continue this conversation. It's a really important one, and I think that this is the kind of video that needs to get out there and be shared with your networks, with your friends, with your neighbors, because we as Canadians need to get politically active. We need to realize the real threats to our democracy. Help us get this information out there. Please subscribe, like, and share throughout your networks, and we'll see you in the next video.